Evening. Thanks very much for joining us on this special edition of India Business Hour. We've got lots to talk about. I'm right outside the Finance Ministry, and this is a ministry that's not going to be particularly happy with the way that the spectrum auctions have panned out, because the target was an ambitious one. It was always ambitious from the start, and perhaps not even a realistic target given the reserve price of the 700 megahertz band in particular, which everyone was complaining about. And so what the government has received by way of bids is shorter than what it was estimating. We've got a power pack lineup with us. Rajan Matthew, the DG of the COAI, also with us. Rajeev Chandrasekhar, telecom industry veteran. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us. Rajan Matthew, to you first. Pretty much along expected lines, no takers for 700 or 900 megahertz. Your first take on the manner in which this auction has panned out. It wasn't a matter of survival because your licenses had already been renewed. There was ample spectrum on the block and perhaps a realistic auction that we've had to contend with then.
So first of all, you should say kudos to the DOT for holding a very transparent, effective and a fully quantum-oriented auction. But again, the results of the auction very much along expected lines. We have said that all along 1800 would be the key area of interest. And again, thanks to the DOT input along with the industry, we freed up 10 megahertz of 1800 megahertz spectrum. So almost 30,000 crore rupees is as a result of the work that the DOT is speeding that up. So clearly that was expected. 2100 and 2300 we said will be kind of the next band that would be of interest. I think the bit of a surprise in this is the demand for 2500 megahertz spectrum. We didn't think that there would be this much demand, but clearly that's a positive development for that band.
Rajan, I'm going to come back to you in just a second. Let me also bring in Rajeev Chandrasekhar in on this conversation. Rajeev, what now? And whenever we've asked whether it's the DOT secretary this question or the TRAI chairman this question, what happens now as far as the 700 megahertz band in specific is concerned? Will the government now be forced to mark it down and then conduct a fresh auction?
No, look, I think we've got to understand that there are many things that drive an auction. Now, obviously, the reserve price is one element of it, and the government could well look into whether the 700 megahertz spectrum has been priced, reserve priced adequately or not. But evidence suggests that the spectrum is something that people do bid for. It's been seen in Canada. It's been seen elsewhere. But I think there may be another way of looking at this, which is there really deep enough competition for these large amounts of spectrum that are being bid when effectively there are only 4 companies bidding. So I think the government will have to examine all of that. When there are 4 companies bidding, is there too much of spectrum being put out there to bid? If this is the spectrum that's being put out there to bid being reserve priced, at an appropriate level? So there are many things that they will examine vis-a-vis the outcome of this auction, not just one element of reserve pricing.
Okay, Rajan Matthew, you want to respond to that? Because so far, industry has been crying about the lack of spectrum. Now we're probably talking about too much spectrum having been on the block. What would you say in response to Rajeev Chandrasekhar's comments there?
First of all, I really don't think there can ever be a situation when there's too much spectrum put on the block. I think it's always appropriate for the government to put on auction all of the spectrum band and the quantum in adequate quantum so that it can be a fair auction where supply is not constrained. So clearly that would be an appropriate thing to do. Obviously the whole auction process is to determine market price. And so I think auctions are the way forward, and I think going forward we have to adjust the prices to ensure that there is market clearing of the adequate spectrum on demand. So I think that's the way future. I think the government is going to have to look at the repricing of 700 megahertz because quantum of spectrum and the demand of spectrum is only going to go into the future. Please remember, you have demand factors coming up in the future, like the IoT, the Internet of Things, the whole issue of cloud computing. So clearly what you see is incumbents and lead operators bulking up on spectrum to make sure that they don't miss the bus in terms of customer demand.
So post this auction, Rajeev Chandrasekhar, what does the landscape look like to you? I'm just looking at the press releases which are now coming in thick and fast. Airtel saying that it's acquired spectrum for the next 20 years. It has now got 4G and 3G spectrum in all circles. It spent in this auction itself 14,244 crores. Similar story coming in from Idea. Vodafone, of course, the highest bidder at 20,000 crores. And then we know Jio, of course, has entered the fray as well. Given what we've seen now pan out with this auction, the competitive intensity, we've already seen a fair amount of consolidation in the sector. What do you expect going forward?
So I expect two things. I expect that, the regulator will now be quite clear, the regulator and the government will be very clear about the quality of drops that were the bane of the sector for the last several years, and that was being blamed on inadequate spectrum, lack of spectrum, availability of spectrum, etc., etc. So now that most operators are, or all operators are quite comfortably placed in terms of spectrum, they acquired new spectrum, I think consumers can and should and must look forward to better quality service. That's on one. Second, I think it's clear now with the pattern of spectrum acquisition that most companies, if not all, are going to migrate to complete IP networks and to deliver 4G and data and really run business models that are data-centric. So we will see a transformation of the model that we've seen all along to a much more IP-centric, data-centric model in the coming months and years. So these two, I think, one from a consumer point of view, which is the whole QoS, the entire frustration that many millions of customers have on the quality of service and call drop, that will necessarily have to get fixed by the regulator now, with even the regulator getting more powers maybe to take punitive actions against operators that don't do it, given that they cannot blame lack of spectrum anymore.
Yes, quality of service will be an issue. But Rajan Matthew, let me ask you this before we wrap up this conversation. Strategic choices are going to have to be made by telecom operators. The former CEO of Bharti Airtel, in his conversation with us, had said that companies will now need to decide, do they do 2G, 3G and 4G, or do they sacrifice one for the other? And as Rajiv was pointing out, it seems clearly that everyone is moving to the 4G network. So in terms of strategic choices, post this auction now, what can we expect going forward? Rajan? Well, we seem to have lost that link with Rajan. So Rajiv, very quickly, let me end by asking you for your comment on the strategic choices or the sacrifices now that these companies are going to be forced to make.
No, I don't think there's any sacrifice. I think this is a situation where the government has taken a call to put all the spectrum on the table, make sure every one of these operators have enough spectrum that they need for their future growth needs. I can see that two fundamental issues that were issues that were facing up to the sector. One was the whole issue of consumer and customer satisfaction. That will have to get addressed, that will get addressed. And the issue of the transformation of this industry from legacy circuit switch, voice-based industry to being data-centric, database, and the whole transformation triggered by Jio will be completed by this spectrum auction.
Rajeev Chandrasekhar, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18 with your thoughts on the just concluded spectrum auction and what it means for the telecom industry. Let's go across